Welcome to the Imagineering Education Podcast. This is Thomas Riddle. Thanks for joining us for conversations held at the crossroads of education and design, with a healthy dose of inspiration from Disney's Imagineers. Each week, we feature pertinent commentary on relevant issues and informative interviews with leaders and practitioners from the fields of education, design, entertainment, and more. On this episode, we're excited to have with us veteran middle school educator Craig Dickinson. Craig is an 8th grade ELA teacher from Eastern Washington who has a passion for stories. He earned his bachelor's degree from Simpson University and a master's in curriculum and instruction from Washington State. For the past 10 years, he has used Star Wars in his classroom by teaching his students about the hero's journey and how to critically view film. This fall, he and a colleague will be launching Coruscant Community College, a new podcast designed to help teachers use Star Wars and film to reach their students. Besides teaching, Craig very much enjoys time with his wife and 2 kids, and I'm glad that they've loaned him to us for a bit this evening for this conversation that I've very much been looking forward to having. So, Craig, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Craig and I are connected through Star Wars, actually. I got to know Craig first off with when he reached out to us through our work with Star Wars in the classroom. And Craig is one of our first rogues, which is our PLN, our Professional Learning Network in the Star Wars in the Classroom community of teachers who use Star Wars to teach. And I'm honored that I've been able to connect with Craig in his classes over the last several years. Been one of many guests that he's had come in, and I'll have him talk about that in just a little bit. We go in virtually and speak with his kids, which is a great way to expose kids to a lot of different viewpoints. So, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But Craig, we always start this show off with the stories of the people that are on the show. So I'd like to ask you, what's your story?
So I came to teaching kind of late, actually. I always liked school. I was a good student. I enjoyed doing homework. I enjoyed reading and writing and math and pretty much every subject. And I went to college, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I went to college because that's what you do after high school.
Right.
And initially, I was interested in music, and I remember one of the first classes I was in, I was like, this is a lot of math that I don't have any idea what I'm doing. I need to change my major. And so after about a day, I was hooked up with a professor, Dr. Carlisle, at Simpson. And he was an English professor, and I changed my major to English. And he's definitely one of my mentors and one of my inspirations to being a teacher. As I mentioned, I always enjoyed school, did well in school, and I will never forget that the first paper I did for him, I got a C. And I was just flabbergasted. I had no idea why, because he had such high standards for what he wanted in his papers. They were a very specific format, and he was the king of no fluff. He used to say, it's 3 to 5 pages, and that's it. Anything longer than that, it's just full of stuff that doesn't belong. And so I put my nose to the grindstone. I figured out how to write for him, and then I took him for everything I could. So in a lot of ways, he was like, this is what I want to do, because I enjoy reaching the students, and he just got me in a certain way that just made sense. But even still, I went into the private sector for a while and didn't want to teach. And then after a couple of years, just like, you know what, I own an English degree. I should be using this. And, after some time off, I wanted to go back and become a teacher.
It's always heartwarming to hear a story about an individual teacher who inspired somebody to go into education. And it sounds like you definitely have your Yoda in that professor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, I know that you, as an English teacher, you probably spend a great deal of time teaching students about stories. And, Walt Disney was a master storyteller. He understood the power of stories to teach and to inspire. And it's always fun to learn of other teachers who, like yourself, who really tap into that power to teach their students. So, but before I ask you about how you do that in class, I have to ask you, when you were a kid, what kind of stories did you like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think back, some of my earliest memories are superhero stories. I loved Superman the movie. That was one that always stuck with me. I loved the Super Friends. Spider-Man was on. I remember coming home after school. That was on. Star Wars, obviously. But even as a small kid, the things I gravitated toward would be the A-Team, Dukes of Hazzard, Fall Guy shows with, less so Dukes of Hazzard. But you think of A-Team and Fall Guys, people that are helping out other people that they have no other way to get to it, and action and just a lot of fun. I think more than anything, just a lot of fun. But I've always been drawn to sci-fi and fantasy as well. But
you're speaking my love language.
Those are like the big three.
Oh yeah. I loved those, man. I love those shows, and those stories were exciting for me as well. And of course, I have that, we share that common love for Star Wars. I'm interested though, has your taste in stories changed? Are you still kind of drawn towards the action hero, sci-fi type fantasy stories, or what kind of stories do you enjoy today?
Yeah, I still enjoy sci-fi. I'm still a huge Star Wars fan. That's still my number one. Mm-hmm. But I'm like Marvel and DC. If I had to choose one, I'd say DC. That's because it's a generational thing. I think that those of us that grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, that's kind of what we had, and so that's what we gravitate towards. But it's also, I think my tastes have expanded a little bit, where I've become more interested in drama. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of anything that Aaron Sorkin does. Mm-hmm. He's like my favorite writer. So my wife and I are currently rewatching The West Wing for the umpteenth time. Right. Which I think should be required viewing, especially this time of year, this time in what's going on in society. Right. It's a great show, but yeah, I love his writing. I end up talking like his characters after I watch it, which makes me feel smarter. And anything with Daniel Day-Lewis, he's become a massive icon to me. We just watched Lincoln with the kids; they'd never seen it, and that was just another. Yeah. I just wanted to feel patriotic, wanting to feel hope. Mm-hmm. And
that film,
I think those stories,
yeah, that film definitely. Lincoln is a fantastic film for those who've not seen it, and Daniel Day-Lewis did an amazing job in that role. So you said that your kids watched Lincoln. So what was their response to that?
Well, we had to put the subtitles on because they were having a hard time keeping track of what was going on. Right. Because there's a lot happening.
There is.
And we had to pause it multiple times and kind of explain this is what's going on. But they got into it by the end. They were recognizing, right versus wrong, and what side he was on, the length that he would go to make things right. And the things that they really gravitated to, what was funny, though, he told so many stories, and the jokes that he would tell, that they just started to laugh and started to get it, and started to get that this guy is just, as great of a man as he was so down to earth as well. And so it's hard not to be drawn to that character. And so they got a lot out of that too.
That's good. And, listening to you say that you used the subtitles, and you'd stop, you'd pause the film and then explain some things. That's really what you do in a classroom, though. If you're teaching well with a film, it's not just, I think we all experienced those classes where a teacher put the film in and said, okay, just watch. But, it always requires, if you're going to teach it effectively, some sort of preview. And if you need to stop and discuss during the course, you absolutely do that during the course of the film. So, I know you've had a good deal of experience teaching with film in class. And so I'm interested to know, what role do you believe stories have in teaching and in learning? Why are stories so important for us to use in our classrooms, no matter what the subject area?
Right. I would say that the biggest thing with stories, the reason they're important is that they make things more concrete or relatable. Kids will say, well, give me an example of that. To me, that's why you need a story. Where would I use this in life? You hear those kind of things too. Well, let me give you an example of this is something that happened to me. Let me tell you a story about that. Along with that, you could say, stories, I think especially in literature, that they give you a chance to learn something, hopefully vicariously, instead of, I used to teach a book when I taught sixth grade called On My Honor. And for those of you that don't know, there's two boys and one of them dares the other one to go swimming in this very dangerous creek, and the one boy dies. And the other kid has to learn the importance of telling the truth through this, because he doesn't initially, and then he does at the end. And you tell the kids, like, I never want you to experience this firsthand, but when you're faced with these situations, you can think about characters in a book that had these similar choices. You see what happens when they do that. So hopefully they can kind of have a, for lack of a better word, safe experience with that tragedy, if that makes sense.
Right, it does. What are some other favorite stories that you've used in your classroom, novels and such?
One book that I really like for eighth graders is The Secret Life of Bees. I like that for a couple of reasons. One is that it's really interesting for eighth graders because the main character is their age. She's a 14-year-old girl. It's set in 1964, so it's in the middle of the civil rights movement, and she is, for lack of a better word, adopted by a trio of black women, sisters, and she learns for the first time that she's white and they're black, and she's never looked at people differently, but she starts to see why other people do and why that's not important. And so it's a coming of age story. She has some family drama with her dad, and there's some past with her mom that died, and so it's kind of one of those stories where you hope the kid never experiences these kinds of things, but can kind of vicariously experience these things.
Right.
It's also, another reason I like it is that ninth graders in our district always read To Kill a Mockingbird. And there's a lot of similar themes in the two books. And so it's a much easier read than To Kill a Mockingbird is. So it's a really good primer, I think, for that.
Really powerful writing can impact a kid for a long time because it makes them think of things that they would never have thought of before. It introduces them to concepts through a story because they're just reading a story. And, it seems to be non-threatening. And it allows them to be confronted with ideas that perhaps they've not thought of before. So I've not read that book, but I think I'm going to definitely add it to my list. Do you know who the author is?
Yeah. Sue Monk Kidd is the author. I will caution anybody that's going to read it and read it, preview it before you read it to kids. There is some heavy themes in there, and there is some language.
Right.
But it's a really good opportunity to kind of to pre-teach that and talk kids through why things are the way they are in this book, and to kind of, these kids have heard the words before, and it's kind of fun that that's also an easy way to get buy-in, because wow, the teacher just said a swear word.
Right.
But in context, it makes sense. There's a reason that it's there.
Right.
But it is a great book, and it has a lot of value, and it's very engaging for just about any kid.
Awesome. So while we're talking about stories, let's go ahead and jump to the inevitable. I want to talk to you about Star Wars. For those of you who are listening who've never seen Star Wars, well, I understand. We invite you to watch it. But I tell you, as a history teacher, I've found it as one of the most valuable teaching tools, introducing that saga in my history classes to teach a number of different content themes. And I know that you do it as an ELA teacher as well, that you use it in your classes. So tell us how that came about and how you're teaching with Star Wars.
So I started teaching with Star Wars in my second year. I don't think I was brave enough to do it in my first year. But the thing that really started me on the path was there's a History Channel, I believe, documentary called
The Legacy Revealed.
The Legacy Revealed. That's the one.
Yep.
And it was just on one day, and I was sitting and watching it, and I'd seen all the movies multiple times, but I was just blown away by all of this, the symbolism that harkened back to ancient things, and hearing academics talk about it just really, I guess, like, it kind of justified for me that this could be something I could spend some time on in class. That there's a valuable information. There's with archetypes and the hero's journey coming through. That this was something that I was interested in, and that there would be a format that I could use in my classroom for this.
That's a similar story to mine. I started teaching with Star Wars I started teaching in 1991. And over the years, I would make references to things from Star Wars, like when trying to explain the Force, trying to explain Taoism and using the Force. And there's a light side, there's a dark side, and compared it to yin and yang, or yin yang. And it wasn't until I read Mary Henderson's book called Star Wars, The Magic of Myth. It was a companion to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum's exhibit by the same name. When I read that book, and I think that was 1997 when that book came out. Yeah, it was the 20th anniversary of Star Wars. And I was on a flight to Japan, actually, and had a long flight, 13 hours. And I picked that book up, and I was always a Star Wars fan. It's from the time I was a kid, and had taught with it loosely on and off. And then as I was going through reading that book about how Star Wars really was a modern-day myth, and all about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, it was all laid out. I very much like yourself, I was like, wow, there's some meaty stuff here I can get into and teach in my ancient history classes. And so really designed a curriculum around that, and never looked back. So started teaching with that in the following year, 1998, full on throughout my entire ancient history class. So how are you using it specifically, and what films are you using, or are you using any of the books or shows as well? How exactly are you incorporating Star Wars in your classroom, an ELA classroom?
So the hero's journey is the reason that I teach it. And so that becomes the focus for the entire unit. Essentially, it's a hero's journey unit is what I call it. And over the years, it's evolved multiple times. And so at this point, what it is I kind of seed in tracking film aspects throughout the year. We read Secret Life of Bees, and we watch the movie. And when we do that, I have taught kids how to look at cinematography and sound.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do Anne Frank, I have them focus on performance and set design. So it's preloaded. By the time I get to Star Wars at the end of the year, I always do it at the end of the year. It's kind of a culmination of everything we've done, review of character, plot, and theme. And now it can be a review of film aspects as well. So instead of having to teach them right ahead of time, they've got 6 months worth of practice doing this. So, but I introduce Hero's Journey the day before we start film, the Star Wars films, and go through. And what I do is I have a PowerPoint that we go through the basics of what it is, and then I show them how different events in Star Wars match up very easily with Harry Potter, with Lord of the Rings, and with Avatar. I used to use Matrix, but then a lot of kids hadn't seen it. And there's tons of movies that you can use that all fit the same framework. And so you could say, well, when this thing happens in this movie, it happens exactly like it happens in each of these other movies. We get to the mentor figure. He's the old guy with the beard, and Obi-Wan is Gandalf, who's Dumbledore. So it all matches up really nicely. So introduce, hey, there's this concept. I want you to look at Luke's journey and understand that Luke is this archetype that has been in existence for thousands of years and in multiple cultures. So there's a reason that you identify with him. From there, we jump into episode 4. And the reason that we start with episode 4 is I think every person who's never seen Star Wars should start with episode 4.
Here. I'm with you. Yep.
It's the perfect introduction to the universe. Everything's explained really concisely.
It's how Lucas planned it.
It's how Lucas planned it, and it's basically self-contained. So if you never see another one, you get a beginning, middle, and an end. And you're satisfied with that. And the first year that I did it, I just did episode 4. That was the whole thing I planned around. And then we had a couple more days into school, and so I was like, I'm going to show them Empire because Empire Strikes Back, you know. And then we had some time for Jedi, and so I showed most of Jedi, and that was fun. And then I started getting more interested in the parallels between Anakin and Luke. So how do I do that? How do I incorporate, you know, how do I show these things rhyming?
Right.
And it wasn't until I couldn't figure it out. It wasn't until I heard Sam Witwer talking about it on Full of Sith, the Full of Sith podcast, that he was talking about something that's often referred to as the machete order.
Right.
Which unfortunately cuts out Phantom Menace, which I don't do. So I show episodes 4 in its entirety, episode 5, and then I go back and show all 3 prequels, and then episode 6. And so when we get to Anakin blowing up the droid control ship in 1, I can say that's like Luke blowing up the Death Star.
Right.
And so these parallels that keep happening, be like, remember when this happened? This is like that. This is like that.
I once heard Lucas talk about those themes very much are influenced by jazz. He's a big fan of jazz. So you'll have one theme with riffs of, you know, varying tunes related to that theme. So you have Luke blowing up the Death Star and at the end of episode 4, and then you've got Anakin blowing up the droid control ship at the end of episode 1. That's a really cool way to introduce them to that thematic storytelling, Craig. I like that version. I like that you're waiting to show Return of the Jedi at the end. I don't think I realized you did that. That's really, how did the kids respond?
Yeah, they love it. And for me, it's the closest thing I can get to making them wait like we waited between Empire and Jedi.
Right.
Like you gotta have the wait, because I've done it other ways where, like the first year that Force Awakens came out, I only had time to show 4 movies, and so I showed 4, 5, 6, and 7, and I missed the gap in between 5 and 6. It feels so natural to make them wait.
Yeah. What's
going to happen? Is he really? Because you know what's going to happen to Han. But what's great is you can say, well, is Vader telling the truth?
Right.
Is he not? And then you can go, well, yeah, he is. Now let's watch what happens. Watch how he gets there. But my favorite thing about it is that you get to show him go into the suit in 3, and then you see him take it off at the end of 6. And so watching Revenge of the Sith and Return of the Jedi back-to-back, they rhyme so well.
Well, that's cool.
It's a totally different experience watching that, especially after they see Anakin descend at the end of Sith and then see Luke show up in black at the beginning of Jedi. Mm-hmm. And kids that hadn't seen it, I've actually had kids say, wait, did he go to the dark side?
Right.
And like, yes, I've manipulated you into thinking that. You know, and we, you know, it's things that, you know, when we first saw it, we never made those connections.
Right.
You know, we didn't think, oh, Luke's bad. But you see him choking out a pig guard, and you're like, wait a minute.
Right.
Something's wrong here.
Yeah.
So just playing around with the order, it just freshens up the movie for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can tell the story in different ways.
Yeah, I like that. I like, too, what you said about episode 4 being so self-contained. And, of course, you know, when Lucas made that film, he didn't know that he had plenty of story to continue to tell, but he didn't know if that would just be a one-off, if he'd have a chance, you know. He didn't know if it was going to flop or how it was going to be received. But I love the fact that he was so heavily influenced by Akira Kurosawa. And Kurosawa's way of storytelling is to drop you right into the middle of the action so that as an audience, you're a little discombobulated at first. You're not sure what's quite going on. And Lucas does that brilliantly with the opening scenes of episode 4. You know, I remember as a kid thinking that when the stormtroopers came through, they were dressed in white. I mean, I was 8 years old when I saw Star Wars on the big screen. And when the stormtroopers came through, I thought they were the good guys because they were wearing white armor. And then I was like, but wait a minute, who are these men that they're shooting? And wait, who's who? And I remember in a split second being very confused until I saw Vader walk in. And then I was like, okay, those guys are bad. That's a great way of storytelling to grab your attention right off the bat. You're hurled into the story immediately. And I think episode 4 has just so many classic beats to it and is a great introduction to the hero's journey. For those who aren't familiar with the hero's journey, if you're listening, I think Craig and I both would highly recommend Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which really, it's an academic book. There's some meat to it, but it really lays out Campbell's ideas around the monomyth, that all world cultures essentially tell the same story, that all the heroes are for more or less the same, as Craig was talking about, the archetypes. And Campbell coined the phrase monomyth, and he kind of lays out the steps that all heroes go through in different stages: the call to adventure, the dark road of trials, and then the return of the hero, which in Star Wars was episode 4 is the call to adventure. The dark road of trials, of course, is the Empire Strikes Back, and then the return of the hero literally is Return of the Jedi. That book, and also the interview with PBS.
Moyers, right?
Oh yeah, thank you. It's Bill Moyers. And that book, you can highly recommend that video series, but if you don't want to watch the video series or can't find it, you could look on YouTube. I'm sure you can find that. But the book is really well. It's just a transcript of Moyer's interview with Campbell. It's called The Power of Myth, and would highly recommend that one to you as well. Craig, let me ask you this. When you have kids that come into watching this film, how many of them have never seen it before? I mean, just do you usually have a handful or a majority, or what would you say that is? And then secondly, for those who haven't seen it, what's the reaction?
So I was going to say that over the last 4 years or so, that's changed dramatically. Before Force Awakens came out, it was like 50-50 hadn't seen it, which blew me away.
Yeah.
At this point, we're probably, I'm sure 75% of my students had seen it ahead of time, or had seen something of it. What I got this year more than anything was kids had seen The Mandalorian. That's what they'd seen. So they hadn't maybe seen the films, but they knew who Baby Yoda was. Yeah, I mean, we watched a little bit of episode 4 in January because we were doing William Shakespeare's Star Wars. So I actually watch A New Hope multiple times during the year. But they would go, hey, isn't that, like, they'd see Jawas. Weren't those guys in The Mandalorian? Which is hilarious. That's their frame of reference. That's their entry point.
Right.
Which is fun. But I would say, so I have basically 2 camps that come in every year. I have the kids that have seen it and the kids that haven't. And I always have to kind of pull aside some of the ones that I know have seen it multiple times, and they're finally, this is their wheelhouse. This is the place that they really know everything. Right? And I have to say, look, I know you know it, but I need you to just let everybody else experience it.
Right.
I say, I guarantee you that watching their minds explode as those big reveals happen is way more fun than just blurting it out. Like, let them experience and let you watch that happen. Because I see it every year. Kids like, oh my gosh, that's his dad.
Mm-hmm.
Or I've had a girl one year, he's Yoda? I'm like, how did you not know that's Yoda? But, these things, that happens. Things slip through the cracks.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So you have those, but then I think the vast, vast majority of kids that haven't seen it enjoy it. And sometimes they don't enjoy episode 4 because it's, by modern standards, it's a pretty slow movie. But you get about halfway through Empire, and I've got them.
Yeah.
Like, that's it. Like, we're in. Yoda shows up, Han and Leia are stuck together, and you're mine. I have you now.
Oh, middle school kids understand Han and Leia for sure, right? At least 8th graders do. Big gap between 6 and 8, but yeah, they'll get that. And the thing that I love about Empire, which, by the way, is, I think, either my number 1 or number 2, it depends on which day you ask me, of all 9 movies. I love Empire. And what's interesting is that Lucas went against convention and dropped the major battle scene at the very first of the movie. And again, it's one of those great moments where they pulled you in right off the bat. And you if you do that, if you kind of blow that big excitement at the beginning of the story, you might think, well, what else do you have? Well, then he introduces us to Yoda, and then it goes from there, and then again, like you said, with Han and Leia, and then Boba Fett shows up, and that's just a great film. I'm glad kids really like that one, and we can sit around and here for a few minutes. We've been talking about kind of our mutual love for Star Wars and how much it's great to teach with. But Star Wars aside, what's been the results for learning that you've seen with kids learning in this manner? Have you seen an increase in retention because they're engaged, or what's been the learning outcomes from using Star Wars?
Yeah, engagement goes through the roof with this. I've got kids that thing all year long will sit up and at least pay attention. And that when we do the viewing, we stop it periodically. There's a writing component. There's small and large group discussion, and I can usually get them to do a little bit of everything. Even those kids that those intentional learners, they'll be engaged with this. And the more I do this, the more I get that reading and viewing really are using the same skills. I mean, I'm asking the kids to do essentially a close read of the film, to pay attention in the same way that you would if you're reading a novel.
Mm-hmm.
You should be looking at foreshadowing. You should be looking at characterization. It might come across in a different way, but you're doing the same things. And so hopefully, as ninth graders, they've practiced some of those skills, so when they read a novel, they can still pull out some of those same things.
Do you give any sort of a viewing guide with that for them things to notes to follow along with, things to be looking for? So what made me think about that is when you're talking about close reading and you're getting the kid to really focus in on what they're reading. Do you do that when they're watching the film, or do they just watch?
Yeah, so I have a packet that I've developed, and it's something that I've made available. It's on Star Wars in the Classroom, and it's in our podcast website as well, where there's essentially 6 aspects that kids are tracking, and they're sitting in groups, table groups, and so everybody, they could 4 to 5 other people at their table are all looking at the same thing. So one group's just looking at cinematography, and so they can kind of help each other with that, or they're just listening for the sound. And so I think at 40 minutes is what the breaks I have about 40 minutes, they debrief, and then we talk whole class, and then they rotate. And so they're only focused on one thing primarily. And I usually sit myself in the back next to some of those kids who I know aren't necessarily engaged right away, and kind of guide them through certain things.
Well, I would. I'm familiar with that. That was kind of a softball question, I guess, because I wanted Craig to address it, but because I've seen that material, and for those of you, most of you guys have not. And if you're an ELA teacher, and if you're interested at all, and it doesn't have to be Star Wars, it could be in any film that you want to use. Craig has some amazing materials that you could use for Star Wars or modify and adapt. And so at the end of the show, we're going to give you some contact information so you can follow Craig's work and find out how you can see that. But I highly recommend for any teacher who is going to be teaching with film that you have some kind of guided activity, and Craig does that extremely well. So let me ask you this, Craig, and then we're going to move on from Star Wars. What's been the reception when you've invited these outsiders like myself to come in and chat with your students for a few minutes about our perspectives of Star Wars?
I'd say for the most part, they're very excited to be hearing another voice other than mine, and have been really respectful and have been very engaged. I've seen kids that don't usually talk, they'll start to get into it. So, I can talk to this person. I can get information from them. Someone else will listen to me. It's just a change of pace. And then you see other kids that are engaged to begin with. They're like, okay, wow, I have someone that's an expert in this. I have an opportunity to really get this question asked. And maybe I try to have open-ended questions for them to answer while we're doing this as well. And so a lot of times we have this awesome thing that happens where my guest will answer the question completely different than I did. And, both responses are completely valid. And so we get to talk a lot more about, it's not about being right. It's more about asking the right kinds of questions.
That's good. Right. I've really enjoyed my time coming in with your class when I've been able to do that. And teacher to teacher, I've been impressed with your kids. They always ask good questions, and they're very attentive, and they behave just like you want them to when you have a guest come in. But if none of you have taken advantage of having outsiders or an outside guest or a visitor come in virtually like that, I highly recommend it, especially in this day and age. We have so many kids that are going to be learning virtually. If you can coordinate a speaker, as Craig said, other than yourself, especially if there's some kind of content expert, to come in and visit with your students, it can add a lot of value. All right, so let's move on here. And as much as I'd love to continue talking about Star Wars, wait, I'm going to hold that thought. One more thing, we're going to talk about Star Wars. You are starting a new podcast, and while we're here, I want to because it has to do with education. Can you tell us a little bit about your podcast? I'm very excited to sign up and become a listener. So what's this new podcast all about?
Okay, so Coruscant Community College, that's what we're calling it. It's basically born out of the responses that I would get from having my stuff posted on Star Wars in the Classroom. I would get emails from people saying, I'm using your stuff. Do you have any suggestions? Would ask me questions. And I can't have conversations with all these people. And so this is kind of like a proactive way to present what we've done. I say we, me and a colleague of mine, Matt Leader, have both used the material in class. And so we're at this point just kind of walking through, this is the rationale for what we do. This is the techniques that we use for using Star Wars in the classroom. Here's the resources that we use, and to kind of have a virtual professional development exchange of ideas type of thing.
I love that. So have you guys launched already?
We haven't launched yet. The idea is that we're going to do it seasonally. And so we've got, I think, 2 more episodes we're going to do, put in the can, and then we're going to promote for a little bit and then launch this fall. That's the plan.
Okay, great. Well, I definitely want to find out when that happens, and we'll spread the message on that for sure. So very much looking forward to that. All right, so let's switch gears just for a minute, because I like to ask veteran teachers like yourself this question. If you could go back in time and give advice to yourself as you entered your first year of teaching, what would that be?
So there's a couple of things. I think, first off, find what makes you passionate and focus on that. Find something that you really are interested in and just dig into that. So that's something that you can share with the kids, because they will pick up on that, whatever that is. It doesn't even matter. As long as you're excited about it, most of them will be excited about it. Some other things that I thought about with that is nothing happens in a vacuum. So if anyone around you, especially students, are having a bad day, it's probably not about you. So just kind of go with the flow a little bit better. Don't take yourself too seriously.
Good advice.
And above all, be flexible. That was one thing that I had to learn pretty early on in my first teaching job. Was we just had some weird years with things with us. We had floods and we had assemblies at weird times, and it was you just need to be able to adjust on the fly, have some things in the can where you can just say, okay, just third period's going to get this today, and just be able to kind of roll with that stuff.
Yeah, that's valuable life skills for our students to see modeled for sure. For us to be flexible. And think, on that note, we often get bogged down and we focus, rightfully so, on teaching content to our students. But there's a lot of other skills. I don't know if I always like the term soft skills. I think that's the new term. When I was growing up, I think it was life skills. But what are some things that you think are important for teachers to impart to their kids beyond just their content? I mean, being flexible is one of those, but what else do you think that is important for teachers to impart?
I want my students to be independent thinkers. I want them to be able to respect different opinions and to argue ideas, but without getting upset at the other person. I want them to be open to trying new things. And ultimately, above all, I want them to accept personal responsibility.
Those are good. Man, can you imagine if we could impart that to every middle school kid? Because middle school is a strange time of life. I taught middle school for a few years, and my wife was almost a career-long middle school educator. And having raised 3 sons that went through that age, I used to enjoy teaching 8th grade because I thought that, that's my last chance to get them before they head into high school, to impart some of those things that you're talking about into them. Some of those things that they're really going to need, that are valuable beyond just the content. And it's funny because I went from teaching 8th grade to then teaching 9th grade in high school, and really looked at it the same way. I used to tell my 9th graders, you're nothing more than oversized 8th graders till at least second semester. You still act like 8th graders, and I would say it partially in jest, but developmentally they're still growing. And 9th grade is so valuable, such an important year of transition. And so again, I think that's important for what you're talking about. If we can impart some of these things, exactly what you're talking about, into our students, imagine if they could become ingrained in them in 8th and 9th grade, so that by the time they finish out their high school career, they are thinking critically. They are respecting the opinions of others. Man, I want adults to do that right now in 2020.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Those are excellent. Thanks for sharing those. I've really enjoyed this talk, and I want to have you back on. But before you go, I want to ask you this question. If you could change one thing in education, if I gave you Tinkerbell's magic wand, and it would be anything at all, what would you change in education today?
Wow. I'd get rid of the standardized tests.
I hear that a lot.
I think, yeah. I really think that the real learning comes from the open-ended questions and the conversations that you have with kids. I have done more actual teaching in the last few years from just having one-on-one conversations with kids. Like, I can stand in front of the class and explain it 17 different ways and think that I've exhausted every last way to say it and explained it perfectly. But until I can have the back and forth with the kid, I won't know.
Right.
And that's just not something that shows up on those tests.
That's right. Yeah. I find there's so much value in what you've said, and extending a conversation. And so many times we feel like that in the classroom, we don't have time. Have you ever felt that way? I've got a pacing
Absolutely.
guide. I've had these standards I have to cover. And look, I'm not knocking pacing guides. When I first started teaching, I spent way too much time on the Civil War. I'll tell you up front. I was teaching 8th grade South Carolina history, and it's such a rich period of history, and so pivotal in how it shaped, even our life today. So pacing guides, I agree with. Standards, I agree with when they are well written, but I think there needs to be some flexibility. I would agree with you when it comes to being able to take some time to reflect, to breathe, to chew on stuff that needs to be that the kids are interested in. That's the one thing that used to kill me a lot of times when I was in the classroom, is that you have kids that are so interested in things now. And some of those kids have never been interested in much at all. And now you've got them, and they want to explore some more, but you just feel like you have to press on because, well, I've got a quarterly benchmark coming up, And again,
Right.
When there's testing that can be that is this formative, that can show you where kids are along the way, completely agree with that. But I think I would agree with you in terms of large scale standardized testing. I think there just needs to be a little bit of reform there. So thanks for that answer. But you're not the only one,
No, I wouldn't think so.
that have said that, and that's interesting that we hear that so much. So, well, Craig, it's been a joy, and I can't believe we've almost been talking for almost an hour. And I definitely don't want to keep you anymore from your family. But before we go, if you can let our guests know, if they want to follow your work, what's the best way for them to do so?
So you can actually access our website already, even though we haven't officially launched. And that is at Coruscant, I'll spell it for you, CORUSCANT, as in community college, .podbean.com. And there's a link there to a shared Google page where you can get all of our resources. You can get our email from there. Our Twitter handle's on there. Facebook should be up shortly. And feel free, beg, borrow, steal from our resources, ask questions, send me an email, send me something on Twitter. I'd be happy to have a conversation about this, or anything.
So the best way, that email they can find on the website?
Yeah, it should be.
Okay, great. And what we'll do, folks...
Let me go ahead and give that out. Just
yeah,
in
go
case
ahead.
It's not. It's C, the number 3, podfeedback@gmail.com.
Great. And what we'll do too is we'll put those links in the episode notes. So when this airs, you can also find the links there. So I highly recommend you follow Craig's work. He's a great educator and has some amazing ideas. And I think the thing I love about him too is that he's always open to collaborate, like you could hear today. So definitely make sure you follow his work. So Craig, again, thanks for joining us, and look forward to chatting again soon. For everyone else, thanks for joining us for the show today. If you'd like to learn more about our work, including our workshops, webinars, speaking engagements, and more, visit our website at imagineeringedu.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at ImagineeringEd and Facebook at Imagineering Education. We hope you'll also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. And when you do, don't forget to leave a review. So until next time, remember that there's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow just a dream away. Be blessed, everyone.